to make a return to the world of Android-based tablets with a brand new entry from ALLDOCUBE, a brand that I have covered in the past here on the channel. The iPlay 80 Mini Ultra is the latest addition to their small form factor lineup of tablets and the successor to last year's iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, which I covered here. But unlike last year's version that had a Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, ALLDOCUBE has opted to return to Mediatek and the Dimensity 8300. The iPlay 80 Mini Ultra has a lot to live up to, as it follows up on a tablet that brought a nice balance between features, price, and performance. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we take a deep dive into ALLDOCUBE's iPlay 80 Mini Ultra and find out if this Mini Ultra lives up to its name. So let's quickly go over the specs, features, and price, and then we'll do a quick unboxing and tour of the ALLDOCUBE iPlay 80 Mini Ultra. We've got packaging here that is quite similar to what we've seen in the past from ALLDOCUBE, and very clearly highlights the 5G and gaming capabilities right on the front. And gaming is what we hope to do here. As I mentioned, this tablet is powered by the Mediatek Dimensity 8300 that features 8 cores up to 3 GHz and a Mali G615 MC6 GPU up to 900 MHz. Now, while this chip might be new to ALLDOCUBE, we have seen this before on the channel in various handheld devices by Anbernic, and so there's a bit of familiarity here. And speaking of familiar, ALLDOCUBE returns with the same display from the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, which is an 8.8-inch LTPS panel with a resolution of 2560 by 1600 with a 343 ppi that features up to a 144Hz refresh rate and up to 500 nits of brightness, and we do have support for Widevine L1. The iPlay 80 Mini Ultra is available in just one configuration and features 12GB of LPDDR5 RAM and 256GB of UFS 3.1 internal storage, with support for micro SD cards up to 1TB. On board, we've got Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.3, a USB Type-C 3.0 port for data, charging, and video out, and a new addition with support for up to 5G connectivity and dual SIMs, which I know many of my viewers have been wanting to see in a more powerful and a small form factor tablet that includes this capability. I'll have on screen the bands that are supported for both 4G LTE and 5G. We have 2 cameras included here, with a front-facing 5-megapixel camera and then a rear 13-megapixel camera with autofocus and flash, and as expected, these are nothing spectacular and don't expect great results, especially in a poorly lit room. This is all powered by a 7200 mAh battery, which is a slight reduction from the 7300 mAh battery we saw in the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra. ALLDOCUBE claims about 9 to 10 hours of video streaming and 8 to 9 hours of gaming, but we will examine this a bit further later on in the video during the usual battery rundown tests. The iPlay 80 Mini Ultra does support 33-watt fast charging, and likewise we will confirm this in the battery section. The iPlay 80 Mini Ultra ships with Android 16 and ALLDOCUBE OS 5.0 L out of the box, and ALLDOCUBE has informed me that they will be offering an upgrade to Android 17 when it is available, but currently has no availability date. As of this moment, we are on Android 16, and so that is what this video will reflect. In the package, ALLDOCUBE provides the usual user manual, a SIM tool to gain access to the microSD and nano SIM tray, a USB Type-C to C cable, and for some mind-boggling reason, only a 20-watt power adapter despite the claim for 33-watt charging. There's also a pre-applied screen protector on the tablet, but I highly recommend removing it and using your own since it's really not that great. And finally, the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra should be available for ordering by the time this video goes live, and will have a launch price of $314.99 from April 10th through the 15th, and will be available on storefronts like AliExpress, Amazon, and for US buyers, it will also be available later this month on Walmart's website. After the launch period, the retail price will be $369.99 US, and I will be taking just a brief moment towards the end of this video to kind of talk about pricing in general, since things are a bit chaotic currently in the tech space. I'd also like to thank ALLDOCUBE for sending this tablet ahead of launch, so that I could properly evaluate the tablet and provide this in-depth coverage to my viewers. As I always require, ALLDOCUBE has not reviewed any of this footage prior to publishing. So let's now take a quick tour around the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra and see what we have going on here. And immediately, if you're familiar with the prior model, the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, this is essentially the same chassis that the current model here is reusing. So in terms of materials and how it feels and looks, it's quite similar. Now, I thought the build quality was pretty solid with the prior model, and I do feel the same about this one here, and the clean finish returns with the red accent for the power button, as well as being nearly identical in thickness at 7.75mm, but coming in just slightly lighter at 330 grams. We do have the same 8.8-inch 2.5K display returning here that supports up to 144Hz. And this is still a very solid display that I believe is an older panel from the earlier generations of the Lenovo Legion Y700. And it was a highlight for the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, and I think it remains a highlight here with great viewing angles, colors, and my particular unit doesn't have any issues with backlight bleeding, and in general I think it looks great for any type of media consumption, and of course gaming. The pixel density is solid as well, thanks to the 2560 by 1600 resolution that offers a 343 ppi. It's really going to be much of the same across the board, as we have the same stereo speakers returning from the prior model that is set up in the horizontal layout. And just like I found the speakers to be one of the best from ALLDOCUBE at the time, this still holds true here, but in terms of other tablets in this space, there are definitely better options, so these are neither the worst or the best that I've experienced from a tablet, and perfectly suitable with a volume that gets very loud and remains clear at that top end with appropriate scaling through the volume control with Android. In terms of software, the same game mode feature returns from the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, and just like that tablet, it remains very basic and doesn't really offer any kind of performance adjustments, and it really is just for minimizing notifications. And this is still an area I'd like to see ALLDOCUBE put a little more effort into, especially if this is going to be branded as a gaming tablet. So now that we're familiar with everything about the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra, let's talk about what is powering this on the inside. As I mentioned, we've got the Mediatek Dimensity 8300 here, which is an interesting choice since in many ways, at least in terms of synthetic performance, this is more of what I would call a side grade, as can be seen when compared to the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, and the two are quite similar in performance. On the CPU side, looking at Geekbench 6, we can see that the Dimensity 8300 lags behind the Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, found in the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, and in terms of other small form tablets that are similar in power, I thought that the Legion Y700 Gen 2, also known as the 2023 edition, with the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 is another similar comparison point, and we can see that it kinda sits nicely between the iPlay 70 and iPlay 80. This is also useful since essentially every model past the Gen 2 will be more powerful than any of these tablets on screen, so for your own shopping comparisons, this is a good starting point. Now in terms of GPU testing, the three are all very close in performance with a slight edge again to the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra and the Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3. It is worth mentioning that while synthetic numbers show theoretical power, there is more at play here, and certainly there are more advantages to a Snapdragon chip over a Dimensity chip because of better support, which we will see a bit of later on during some game and emulation testing. Finally, we've got the Antutu benchmark suite for an overall idea of performance, with the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra coming in at about 1.65 million for its overall score. The iPlay 70 Mini Ultra does lag behind on its overall score and is similar to the Y700 2023. But as I said, synthetic numbers only paint one story, and there is another story to be told here with the thermals. And I did run the Wildlife Extreme stress test, which came back with a 75.6% stability percentage, and we can see that it starts off strong but immediately dips after the first loop to represent its closer baseline score, which ends at a lowest score of 2176. Now I ran it a second time and even a third time at a later date, and much of the same is apparent here, and it was even worse than before with a 68.4% stability percentage. The thermal issue becomes pretty apparent in real-world usage when I was doing my emulation testing, and I will talk about more what's going on there in that section as well as during my battery testing. So what's even more wild is that when compared to last year's iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, that tablet had a 93% stability percentage with its lowest loop score of 2816 that ends up being similar to the Dimensity 8300 with its best loop score. Now for science, I did grab a Red Magic cooler that I had on hand, and I couldn't quite position it where I wanted, but regardless it did help with the numbers and overall stability of the scores, bringing it up to an 82.2% and a lowest loop score of 2328, which shows that this is in need of some additional cooling for the peak performance. And for example, in the Anbernic handhelds that have this chip, we do have active cooling on hand to best utilize it. So before diving into gaming, I always like to gear up and explore some of the telescopic controller options that we have for this smaller form factor, and because it is a small form tab, we've got lots of options for the form factor nowadays. I've covered many of them in the past, so you can always reference some of my older videos if you're curious, especially my iPlay 70 Mini Ultra videos since they are the same size. But we do have some new options that I'll be featuring here on the channel for the first time, or I should say some new color options that are pretty cool, including this Absolute S8 in an awesome GameCube indigo color, and then the Absolute S9 in this Famicom color. I've talked about both of these models before, but I actually bought these new colors for myself, and I think they're both solid options for small tablets, with the S8 being a Bluetooth only option, and then the S9 offering a hardwired solution with its USB-C port, but it can also be set in a Bluetooth mode for those problematic Android games. I've also got a roundup of some Gamesir controllers here, starting with one that I frequently like to feature, which is the Gamesir X5 Lite, since this is a great budget option that is a no-frills controller, but just a cheap way to get into a telescopic controller, and it's also very lightweight. There is the Bluetooth version of this controller, which is the X5S, and between all of these four options, I don't think you can go wrong, and they all work great with the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra. Now just keep in mind, if you have plans on using this in a vertical orientation, that the Bluetooth options will be your best bet, since it doesn't have a dual USB-C port like the Y700, so you can't go hardwired. Okay, so now it's time to talk about some native Android gaming, and I've got quite a few games here to showcase, which will give us a good idea of the kind of performance that we can expect with the native Android games, and in general, I will say that this tablet will handle quite a bit of what's available on the Play Store without any issues, but because of the thermal throttling, you will need to keep your expectations in check in terms of graphical fidelity and adjust accordingly. But if your use case is specifically for Android gaming, the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra will do decently here. You can probably see on screen that I've had Destiny Rising running here, which does quite well at the max rendering quality using the standard frame rate setting, which does give us some flexibility for adjustments, but it is very smooth with this setting. The same can be said for Wuthering Waves, although this is where we start to see the limits of the hardware. I'm running this at the Ultra Performance Graphics preset with a 30 frames per second target, and even then it can struggle. You'll see dips below 30 frames per second at times, and trying to push to 40 or 60 frames per second just isn't realistic here, even on the lowest settings. This is a demanding title, no doubt about it, but the performance here is a bit disappointing, and it really shows that this device is being pushed pretty hard and unable to manage its thermals properly. Now for Endfield, I'm sticking with low graphics at a 30 frames per second target, and this ends up being a fairly stable experience overall. Nothing groundbreaking here, but it's definitely playable and consistent enough if you're okay with dialing things back. I'm pretty excited about this next game since Warframe is now on the Play Store, and this is the first time I get to feature this game on the channel with Android. For Warframe, I'm using the high quality preset with a 30 frames per second cap, and while you will see some dips here and there, it's mostly consistent. The nice part is that you do have some room to adjust settings if you want to improve the performance slightly, so there's a bit of flexibility depending on how you want to balance visuals and performance, but this is probably one of the better performing games that I've tested here with the Mini Ultra. Where Winds Meet is another fairly new Android release, and for this game I've opted for the Super Performance mode, and this is really the only way to get a consistently playable experience. It's clear that this is another demanding title, and while it does run, it's definitely leaning more towards being a compromise than optimization. And finally, I always like to feature at least one premium or paid experience, and for this showcase I'll be going with Red Dead Redemption, which is running at its default of 30 frames per second with stable performance, and out of the bunch here, I didn't experience any type of frame dips. It's smooth, consistent, and doesn't really require much tweaking to get the game to run as you see here, making it one of the better examples for this tablet. I will say there is a way to get this game running at 60 frames per second, but I didn't bother because I wasn't very optimistic based on what I've seen in general. So overall, while the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra definitely falls short in some of the more demanding scenarios we've looked at earlier, when it comes to native Android gaming, everything will run, but that is obviously met with some compromises that are difficult to ignore at this price bracket. And this is even more apparent with emulation, as the raw power is there, but because of thermal management, we are having to leave that power on the table unless some type of external cooling is used with the tablet, but as is, this will impact performance. For example, I started out with some GameCube emulation using F0GX to get a feel of where we land here with the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra. And at first, it appears that the tablet can handle the max of 6 times the native resolution of GameCube, but give it about 5 minutes and the throttling starts to show up, and ultimately the best we're going to get with stable performance is only 2 times upscaling. The same holds true for Wii, which is slightly more demanding than GameCube, and basically you're going to be looking at only 2x upscaling as well, and I tested this with some of my usual games like Klonoa and Super Mario Galaxy 2, which again could in theory handle more, but to keep the experience smooth and stable, I ultimately settled on just 2x. Now thermals aren't the only thing we have to contend with here, as the Mali GPU has always been a bit more problematic when it comes to compatibility and just general driver support. For example, taking a look at Wii U emulation with Simu, the experience is a mixed bag, and really Wii U should be treated as a bonus platform for this tablet, since the combination of both the worst compatibility with the Mali GPU and the thermals means we either don't have enough performance for some of the more demanding games to run, like Breath of the Wild, or we're stuck with severe graphical issues that render them unplayable, like the Wind Waker HD, which just has a red screen when you finally get into gameplay. So for some of my usual games that I like to test with, like Fast Racing Neo, it needed to have its resolution dropped to 960 by 540 in order to get the frame rate that you are seeing here in the footage, which can hit 60 frames per second with that setting, and then something like Mario Tennis, which seems to do mostly well, but not quite full speed, and it also suffers from minor graphical issues. So all in all, it's kind of a mixed bag, and that's partly due to the emulator itself, but it's definitely worse off here with this tablet. The same holds true for Switch emulation using the latest build of the Eden emulator, and obviously Switch emulation is constantly in development and evolving, but typically Switch emulation will fare better with Snapdragon based chips with the Adreno GPU because of superior driver support, and so unfortunately with the Mali GPU in the Dimensity 8300, and the throttling means that we will never fully realize the potential of the Dimensity 8300. As such, I'd consider this another bonus platform, and certainly you will be able to get a good amount of games running here, but be prepared to utilize a lower resolution, which is what I've done here for Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, running at 0.75x in handheld mode in order to keep the frame rate and performance as you see here. In general, the more demanding games will need this resolution setting, and something like Super Mario 3D World, and specifically in Bowser's Fury, we can also hit a fairly stable frame rate at full speed, but it's going to be with that 0.75x resolution. Much of the same is true for something like Super Mario Odyssey, which I think are the limits of what this tablet can do since it can hit full speed using a 0.75x resolution, but we're definitely pushing here, and so expect frame rate dips, especially during shader compilation, that will eventually smooth out. It's a shame because Super Mario Odyssey is a game that will run at full speed on the Dimensity 8300. But with the lack of proper thermal management or even active cooling like we see in the Anbernic handhelds with this chip, we will not be able to fully utilize it. And in general, expect that more games will just simply not work at all, or crash instantly or have pretty severe graphical issues because of the Mali GPU. And so temper your expectations with Switch. But given that there are thousands of games, we can certainly get plenty running here, and for an idea of what the Dimensity 8300 can really achieve, check out my Switch emulation video that covers this chipset in those Anbernic handhelds, which I will have linked on screen and in the description. So let's switch on over to the Sony side, and we'll skip over PSP since in general it will be solid here, and instead let's focus on PlayStation 2, which is certainly a bit more demanding. You probably know what to expect by now, and yes, we do have some issues with pushing the upscaling for PlayStation 2 emulation, just like we saw with the other platforms featured up to this point. I mentioned that with something like God of War 2, which is a game I typically start out with when I start my testing, since it gives me a good idea of what to expect, and at first I was very happy, but it didn't take long until I saw that throttling, which was limiting performance, and so for God of War 2 I went from as much as 3.5x upscaling to a more realistic 2x upscaling, which is definitely disappointing and does in general mean that most games for PlayStation 2 will handle at least 2x without running into the limitations here. And then there's PlayStation 3 emulation, and for this we have both APS3E and RPCSX, and for this testing I did use RPCSX, and I actually have a full video about the Dimensity 8300 with the Anbernic handhelds and RPCSX, so if you'd like an idea of what games are at least playable and compatible with the chipset, it's a good place to check out. Unfortunately for the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra, I expect that games might not perform at the same level, but for this footage I did use a 75% resolution scale, with a base resolution of 1280 by 720, and some of my usuals like Resogun and Virtua Fighter 5 did very well, and it's weird because the Dimensity 8300 has always been a fairly solid performer with PlayStation 3 emulation for whatever reason. Also, it's important to keep in mind that PlayStation 3 emulation is still very early in progress, so don't expect the big hitters to run here at all, and generally lighter PSN titles like Resogun will fare better. Let's now completely shift gears and talk about PC gaming on Android, and there's various ways to go about this, including Gamehub, GameNative, and Winlator, and it's a very exciting time for Android, as we have more options now than ever that also happen to work better now than ever. Now, I will have to temper expectations, since we do have that Mali-based GPU, and unfortunately we're running into some of the same issues we've seen before. The reality is that driver support just isn't where it needs to be for the Mali GPU, despite some improvements there, and performance ends up being pretty mediocre overall. In fact, what's kinda surprising here is that something like a Snapdragon 865, for example, which is an older and technically less powerful chip, can actually deliver a better experience in many of these scenarios. And that really highlights just how important driver optimization is for this kind of gaming. That said, it's not all bad news. There are definitely some games that work quite well. Castlevania Lords of Shadow is a great example of a game that runs nicely and is very playable, making it a solid pick if you're looking to revisit something from that era. And even something newer like Slay the Spire 2 performs pretty well here, which is encouraging given that it's a more recent release. Lumines Arise was another pleasant surprise, and this is a visually striking game that can be a bit demanding depending on the effects and particles on screen, but overall it holds up pretty well on this device. Now on the other hand, GTA 5, which is a game I like to use to benchmark performance when it comes to PC gaming on Android, is where things start to show some cracks. The performance here is just okay, and while it's technically playable, it's nowhere near as smooth or consistent compared to what we saw with last year's iPlay 70 Mini Ultra. And that's a bit disappointing, especially considering this is supposed to be the newer model. And really, that's kind of the story with PC gaming in general for this tablet, as compatibility is going to be all over the place. Some games will work surprisingly well, and others just won't launch at all, and many will kind of land somewhere in between. The reality is you'll see better results on devices with Snapdragon-based chips, thanks largely to the stronger driver support and better overall optimization. So while it's definitely a nice bonus that this tablet can dip its toes into PC gaming, it's not something I'd rely on as a primary use case, especially when there are other devices out there that can handle this far more reliably. So it's probably not much of a surprise for my long-term viewers that I had to of course go vertical and do some TATE mode gaming with the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra, since when you pair this with a Bluetooth telescopic controller, you can enjoy a vast amount of great games that utilize the vertical orientation like ABXYLUTE and other awesome PlayStation 2 shmups that support it. Of course, this orientation is great for Nintendo DS and 3DS gaming, though I've said it before that I definitely prefer 3DS specifically in the horizontal orientation, since less games utilize the bottom touchscreen and the top screen's aspect ratio is just better suited for this. But in terms of DS emulation, performance is solid with Melon DS, with games like Mario Kart running as much as 6 times upscaling, and then when coming back to 3DS, expect that a good portion of the 3DS library will work as long as the emulator has compatibility with it, and a lot of games will do well with upscaling, such as New Super Mario Bros. 2 and Mario Kart 7 that I have on screen here running at a 4x native 3DS resolution using the latest build of Azahar, which makes it look super sharp and clean. So before we move on to the battery segment, let's talk about one last use case for these small form tablets that I also happen to enjoy personally, and specifically because we can fully utilize the 144Hz panel and higher resolution here with streaming locally from a PC using a combination of Apollo and Artemis. And shout out to the Artemis 2 crew that is on their way back to Earth from the moon, and they should be touching back down very soon. Unfortunately, much like emulation and PC gaming, the Dimensity 8300 has some shortcomings, which we can see here with Hades 2, streaming locally from my hardwired PC running at 144 frames per second to match the 144Hz display of the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra, as well as the native resolution of the panel at 2560 by 1600. And we are getting about 13 to 14 milliseconds average decoding with it, sometimes being slightly lower or higher. Now this is definitely not the best or the worst we've seen on the channel, but it is very disappointing coming from the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, which had decoding times that were about a third of what we are seeing here with the Dimensity 8300 and the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra. I did go back and match the resolution to the footage I had for that device, and the results were the same, as well as experimenting with various codecs, resolutions, and frame rates, but it doesn't seem to go lower than the 12 milliseconds or so that you're seeing on screen. And of course, after all this gaming, how does the 7200 mAh battery fare in the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra, which, as I mentioned earlier in the video, has a slightly smaller battery coming in at 7200 mAh versus the 7300 mAh battery in the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra. The combination of the smaller battery and less efficient Dimensity 8300 definitely results in worse battery life overall across the various tests that I typically conduct with the YouTube streaming test at 1080, using 50% brightness and volume, Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, and the power saver turned on. The tablet managed to hit 10 hours, and it does match ALLDOCUBE's claims of 9 to 10 hours of battery life. And then for the lighter emulation test with Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo, again with a 50% brightness and volume, but this time I've got the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned off, but the battery saver option is still on. And this time around, the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra managed just shy of 9.5 hours of on-screen time. Now with the heavier emulation test using God of War 2 for the PlayStation 2, I originally started the test out with a 2.5x upscaling, but noticed that there was still throttling taking place with the battery percentage at about 91%, and so I turned it down to 2x, which seems to be the sweet spot, which I mentioned earlier for the more demanding PlayStation 2 games. With the same 50% brightness and volume, the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and battery saver all turned off, the Ultra managed about just a little over 4.5 hours of on-screen time. In terms of how these compare to the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, we saw about 3 additional hours on the YouTube test, about an hour extra on the Super Nintendo test, and finally, the older iPlay 70 Mini Ultra did have worse performance by about 30 minutes for the PS2 test with God of War 2, but that game was running at 3.5x upscaling with the Wi-Fi on, so I imagine that with the same conditions as the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra, it would perform better. Finally, I tested the charging capabilities, which is advertised at 33 watts, and using the included 20-watt charger, which clearly is below the 33-watt advertising charging speed, I was getting a consistent 16 watts from it, and in the first 30 minutes, it reached a 26% charge, while a full charge took over 2 hours. I did tests with my own chargers that were both a 65-watt and 100-watt charger, and while I was able to hit about 26 to 27 watts with it, it was not consistent and it actually performed worse, hitting 21% in the first 30 minutes, but a full charge took 2 hours and 45 minutes, which is very slow, and I did notice that even at the 30-minute mark, it was not charging at that same 26 to 27 watts that I observed originally. So it's possible that my adapters are the issue here, but regardless, I am not able to test the full capabilities since the included charger is just 20 watts. And the standby performance seems to be decent with about a 1% drop in 12 hours. So before we wrap this all up, I just want to take a moment and just talk about pricing and the general state of things in the market right now. I'm sure you all have heard about price increases because of RAM and storage, and so I was curious to see how it impacted the small form tablet space. And I was pretty saddened to find out that, at least for those of us in the US, there's not a whole lot available. ALLDOCUBE's iPlay 70 Mini Ultra was always in a weird spot for the US market because it was never really consistently available with very limited stock, but globally it does seem to be available, and for the price of that tablet, it's no doubt the better buy compared to the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra. For the regular retail price of the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra, you are starting to get into the Legion Y700 Gen 3 territory. And a quick glance at prices on AliExpress using coupons will put you somewhere around $400 US, which means that for just a little bit, you are getting a significantly more powerful tablet. And with all of that, I think we've covered quite a bit here, and the iPlay 80 Mini Ultra is ultimately a confusing release that probably didn't need to happen. I really do hope that ALLDOCUBE finds their way back to Snapdragon, or at the very least repositions themselves back to being a value-focused brand that in the past has offered a nice balance of features for the price. Anyways, I'm pretty excited because we're not quite done with the small tablets, and I do have a nice treat for the next one I'll be looking at. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.